And I do believe that we have rotten politics, and I'm not using that as an exaggeration.
Hey everyone and welcome. In this video we look at some graphs the government are not showing in the briefings on news channels. These statistics have been put together by two very eminent statisticians and data scientists. It's titled, are we ready? The Dreaded Lurgy, England 2020, The Empirical Truth. Written by Joel Smalley, MBA, data scientist, and Marie Oldfield, a chartered statistician and scientist at the Royal Statistical Society. Now, Joe Smalley holds an MBA from the University of Toronto and works as a blockchain architect and early-stage polymath data-driven technologist. He specialises in fintech, health tech and IoT. He's currently CEO of Supermoney Limited and CIO and CTO of Toucan Labs. Marie Oldfield, we're ready for this one, is a chartered statistician and scientist and a council member of the Royal Statistical Society, an honorary member of the Faculty of Public Health, fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. So esteemed, in my opinion. Now, before we get into this and into these graphs, let's remember Boris Johnson's old words, shall we, regarding the lurgy. On the 23rd of March 2020, Boris Johnson announced to the nation that the lurgy virus outbreak was the biggest threat this country has faced for decades, justifying unprecedented draconian measures of shutting down schools, businesses, shops, confining healthy people to their homes for basic necessities as deemed by the government, and special powers to the police. He continued, there will come a moment when no health service in the world could possibly cope because there won't be enough ventilators, enough intensive care beds, enough doctors and nurses. And as we have seen elsewhere in other countries that have also have fantastic healthcare systems, that is the moment of real danger. To put it simply, if too many people become seriously unwell at one time, the NHS will be unable to handle it, meaning more people are likely to die, not just from the lurgy but from other illnesses as well. So it's vital to slow the spread of the disease. So those are the words of the bozo himself. Let's have a look at these statistics, shall we? The lurgy epidemic ended in June. There is no second lurgy wave, just the residual of the first in isolated areas that were not fully saturated in spring. This is the conclusion these two found in the statistics, everyone. England lurgy mentioned on death certificate by date of occurrence. This is the first graph. Before any naysayers are out there saying these graphs and statistics are fake, they're from the government's own website under the heading Health and Social Care Causes of Death Data Sets. This graph shows that the initial spike was a spike predominantly in the south and London specifically. So if you look at, for example, Lancashire, in March to May, the original spike, they had very few deaths compared to London, but have seen a rise after the summer heat wave from October. This graph shows it's not a second spike, as they're saying in Parliament and the health advisors are saying. Not a second spike at all. It's the first that is now only just reaching the areas that weren't affected at the start. This is true at the local level as well as the regional level, strongly suggesting homogeneous behaviour change as a result of policy or not is not responsible. London lurgy mentioned on death certificate. So as you can see, even for London itself, this graph shows that the areas that got affected the most at the beginning are not the ones that are being affected now. So even on a local level, there is no evidence of successive interventions on the key objective of fatal transmission, just as coincidental rise just after mask wearing was mandated and the vulnerable allowed to stop shielding. Now this graph is the lurgy infections that led to death in England in 2020. In this graph, it, in my opinion, and the statisticians' opinions, shows that the measures that have been taken so far have done nothing. The blue line is infections that led to people passing. The green line is the mobility of the people, i.e. how much getting out and socialising you're doing. So if you look at the beginning where the green line is more erratic, it shows when the panic first started. You remember, we were all self-isolating, then then isolating, then not, over and over and over again. At the slightest thing, because everyone didn't know what it was, did they? Then first lockdown, and mobility dropped through the floor. Can you see it? When lockdown 1 ended and people were slowly going back out, you would expect the numbers to rise quickly again, wouldn't you? But if you look, the statistics don't back that up. Now, if you look at the right side of the line, you will see that why they don't say deaths in the news anymore. They're going down and were before the second lockdown, which makes the lockdown, in my opinion, pointless. but I'd like to know your opinion on all of this. Next, we have a map that backs up the theory that the northern areas affected now are the first wave, finally reaching those areas, not a second wave like they're calling it. It is, however, clear from the local authority data that London was the epicentre of the lurgy epidemic. The scientific reason why London has virtually no lurgy mortality now is most likely due to community immunity and reduction in size of the vulnerable population. It would appear that the virus did not manage to spread fully to remote regions, some distance from London, before being delayed by the summer or any effects of interventions. White areas, if you can see on the map, are the ones affected first. The yellow ones are the ones that came second in infections and deaths, and the red areas are only just being affected. You see what I mean now? That's proof, isn't it? The regions with a later spring lurgy mortality peak are the ones responsible for the autumn lurgy mortality. They have now almost attained the exact same mortality per 100,000 population. Now, this graph shows the areas that didn't have high deaths at the start are the ones that are now rising. This, if added to how many they had at the initial, is very close to what worst hit at the start had per 100,000. Hard to dispute this logic, isn't it, everyone? It's right there in black and white from the government themselves. Next up, we look at deaths from other causes. However, since September, as lurgy-labelled deaths have risen, deaths from other causes have decreased, suggesting that some lurgy deaths are wrongly attributed or displaced. So what we have all suspected, everyone, that they possibly put in lurgy as death when it might not be, seems to be corroborated by this, doesn't it? First spike on the left, you see the black line is lurgy deaths. You'll also notice the rise in deaths from other causes spiked too. You'll remember that a lot of people were too scared, weren't they, to go and get help or treatment and refused to go to the hospitals. So that'd explain the excess deaths there. Now, if you look at the long dotted line, that's the baseline deaths for England. So what should be expected on average? You see the green line drops below that dotted line and stays below that. This is not normal, according to these statisticians. The next page is more proof that other causes of death take a massive drop while lurgy deaths rise. They say, despite a significant reduction in healthcare provisions, apparently cardiac, circulatory and cancer deaths are lower than expected, as are all other respiratory causes. The evidence to support the continued existence of a public health emergency should be substantial, but the empirical, clinical and mortality data strongly suggests there is no such emergency. Number of deaths from all causes occurring on each day, 5-year average and range for England. Now, the next shows the second spike they claim is happening isn't supported by the stats. The stats show a slow rise, not a huge spike like the first time, and they conclude that this isn't the same as March to May. Next up, we have controlling for the doubtful lurgy in autumn. Reveals the true picture of excess mortality caused by lurgy. All the empirical evidence demonstrates that autumn is the residual of the spring epidemic, not a second wave, and is naturally waning. Naturally waning. You hear that? So it shows that since the initial spike, deaths are running only a tiny bit above average. You see what I mean? And they were falling before we were put in the second lockdown. Next up, we see that the data actually shows very little has worked. They have tried to combat this virus. For all the differences in demographics and, more importantly, intervention policy, the course of fatal infection in England is no different, are we ready for this, than Sweden. But unlike England, Sweden didn't suffer any non-lurgy excess deaths at all. The graph on the left shows that Sweden and England are nearly identical for lurgy deaths per 100,000. Only difference being is we ruined our economy and they didn't. If you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that the dispersion is exactly the same as it was in England too. Specific areas got hit first, and the new deaths are not a second wave, it's the first wave finally reaching other areas than the metro areas. Stockholm, for an example, had a spike initially, but they've not recently. Does this not prove, everyone, that plain non-medication herd immunity is achievable if Stockholm didn't get affected twice? It's just a thought. Now you see why I brought this to you, don't you, everyone? These are government data sets. It's not made up by pollers or anything like that. This is facts and figures that the government have been getting placed on their desk. They know this as well, all of them. And yet we're still affected with draconian measures that destroy our lives. Obviously, I'm not saying the lives lost are insignificant. Far from it. Every life lost is horrible. And my heart goes out to the loved ones and family affected. But I am worried the cure will be definitely worse than the virus if we continue down this path against statistical data, which these two honourable people have put forward for us. I have put links in the description, everyone, to an article that Joel wrote that explains it a little bit more than just the graphs. You're more than welcome to go and check it out. I've also put a link to the PDF files for the graphs if you want to have a closer look at them. What I would suggest, everyone, is share this out like it's gone out of fashion, because we need to get this information out for the people, do we not? It seems to be that we're getting more and more proof that everything we're doing to kill our economy and to try and stop this is having very little effect other than kill our economy. But I'd like to know your opinion, everyone. Do you think that this is more proof? Is this something you've known all along? Do you think that Boris knows this and is choosing to not put the information forward? Do you think the media know this and aren't putting the information forward? Why do you think that is? If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit the like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell icon, share it out, everyone. Stay sane in this crazy world, and I'll see you on the next one.